Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to give you guys an early summer tour of my parents' garden. So to begin with, I'll give you a quick summary of what's happened with the weather recently, because we've had some very unusual weather here in North Scotland. So to begin with, it was quite a cool, dry beginning to spring. Then it started to get quite warm. We still had it quite dry though. And then about 2 weeks ago we had a really cold northerly blast and we had some snow falling. We didn't have any settling, fortunately, but it did get close to freezing, so a lot of the plants got a bit stunted in their growth because of that. So for the last 5 days we've had some really unusual weather for this time of year, and it's been around 20-24 degrees most days, about 10 or 12 at night, and just really sunny. So it's been very warm and dry compared to what we usually would have, and some of the grass is starting to go brown, but it's not too bad yet, but certainly it's getting quite dry at the moment. We've had the sprinklers on a little bit to keep the vegetables green, but we're trying to avoid doing the grass too much because we don't want to waste water on the grass when it looks like we're heading into a drought situation. So as I say, it's quite unusual for Scotland. Normally early June, although it's technically summer, I would still think of it as late spring because we can still get frost in early June. You can still get quite cold temperatures. You're not guaranteed warm temperatures in Scotland really until late June or July. But it's been nice having this warm weather, and to be honest, this is the last day of the good weather. It's going down to about 8 degrees tonight and then 12 degrees maximum tomorrow. We're having cold northerly winds, lots of damp weather and rain. So it's going to be a complete change. So I thought I'd get out in the garden while it's nice and sunny and show you how it's doing. So because of that warm spell we've had, everything's really far ahead. So I'll start up here. You can see the lavender here is already coming into flower. This is quite early, and the great thing with this lavender is it seems to flower the whole summer. So once it starts flowering, it keeps going over right into autumn. So this is going to keep flowering nicely. There's quite a lot of lavender around the garden, and there's some more, as you can see further down there. And you can see right at the end there we've got a broom plant. That broom's been flowering really nicely, absolutely covered in flowers now. It's about 5 or 6 years old, that broom, so it's starting to die. They're very short-lived plants. But I've also got another broom that's in full flower over here. This one's a slightly red and orange variety, and that's also looking really nice, you can see there. So generally a lot of good growth in the garden. Things are really coming on nicely. I'll take you down here. The dry weather's also been good because we've not had as many slugs and snails as usual, so the hostas aren't looking too bad. You can see them there, not looking too bad at all. There's a few holes. We'll probably get some more holes in them later this week when it gets colder again, but generally it's been quite a good year for the hostas. Coming along, this is my mother's flower border. It's just starting to wake up now. There's not too many flowers at the moment. This is an Ericium Bowles Mauve, and this is quite a nice Ericium. It's basically a perennial wallflower. It's quite nice because it doesn't set seed. It's a sterile variety, so it keeps flowering, keeps going the whole summer, whereas most wallflowers stop after spring. Coming down here we've got the first geraniums just starting to bud up there. We've got some sunflowers we put in just to fill the spaces. The lupins are up as well. Lupins are a really nice early summer flower. Can get decimated by slugs though sometimes, so we need to keep an eye out for slugs. A few other things coming up. The leucanthemum here is starting to flower, and that's very early to be honest for this flower. This is normally mid to late summer that comes up. There's an achilla as well starting to bud up. Lots of things starting to bud up. Not too much starting to flower yet, as it is still quite early in the season. We do have the cistus here, or otherwise known as a rock rose. And that's got loads of flower buds on it and a few flowers starting to come on. They're looking quite good now. This is quite a nice variety, so it's got a few different colours in the flower. You've got the burgundy, the white and the yellow. A lot of cistus tends to be just more pale, but there's quite a few different varieties of cistus. It's also been a good year for ladybirds. You can see one just there. Seems to be they really enjoyed this dry weather that we've had recently. Seems to have really helped out with the ladybirds. So coming around, a few more geraniums. We've got this rosemary here which is doing well. It's quite in flower at the moment. The rosemary seems to do quite well in our sandy soil. And then we've got this other broom here, which I showed you earlier, which is really nice colours. It almost looks like it's on fire. It's a really fiery, orangey, yellowy red. So that's looking really nice. Then coming round, we've got kind of like a wildflower section here. So we haven't really flatted this up with many wildflowers apart from a yellow rattle. This will be a project I'll probably do later. But at the moment it's just like a nice grass meadow. We just leave it uncut, and then at the end of the year we'll give it a hard cut. And the plan is to plant this up with lots of spring flowers, and eventually this will become like a woodland garden. The trees just need to get bigger though to start casting some shade, weakening the grass, and then I can introduce woodland plants. So it's a real mixture in here. There's quite a lot of the yellow rattle, which is this over here. This is a parasitic plant, and what it does is it parasitizes the grass, weakens the grass, and that allows more of the wildflowers to come through without being swamped out by the grass. We've also got a lot of vetches starting to come up. Not too many of them flowering yet, I don't think. I'll see if I can find one in flower for you. So you can see there's a vetch there with a few flowers, but it's really just the beginning of the season, so not too many yet. Also in this section, we've got we're trying out some Jerusalem artichokes. So you just plant them at the back there. Jerusalem artichokes are pretty much you don't need to do any work once they're planted. They're really big, strong plants. You can see they're already a good size for so early in the year, and these will grow to about 3 or 4 meters in height probably by the end of the season, and then we can harvest the tubers. If we do get a nice warm summer, we might even be able to have some nice sunflower type flowers on them. They tend to have some more sunflowers on them. So the same species as sunflower, so it looks very similar, but it has edible tubers. So we're interested to see how they do. It's the first time we've tried them here in this garden. And generally it's a work in progress here. There's lots of spring flowers in spring, they're all finished, but we'll need to plant more spring flowers and then also plant more summer flowers in this section. So coming round, just a few random plants been put in here and there, like these cosmos here. This is a more established border here, though. You've got the Ceanothus flowering there, the blue at the back. We've also got the spirea just starting up. I'll take you around here now so you can see the archway that I did previously. So the willow's done really well this year. It's put on a huge amount of growth. You can see the archway's greened up nicely. It's also starting to thicken as well. The branches are slightly thicker than they were in winter, but I'm expecting these to put on a huge amount of growth as the summer goes on. And by the end of summer we should have a really strong, thick framework for the archway, and then I'll cut the plants back to the main stems. I won't have all the little bits coming out the top. I might leave them for a little bit in winter as a windbreak, but the idea is to cut it back every year and just keep the more sturdy archway so that it keeps a nice, neat archway appearance. And coming around to the vegetable section, I won't show you a huge amount of the vegetables because I'll probably do a second video for that. I find these tours probably get a bit too long if I include all the vegetables, and I can't do the polytunnel or greenhouse today because it's far too hot. The camera will steam up, and I'd find it hard to think when it's about 40 degrees in there. But I'll show you the cabbages quickly. You can see they've done really well. Green cabbages at the far end, red cabbages slightly closer. Then right next to us here we've got cauliflower, and then a little bit further back in the middle there is where the Brussels sprouts are. So they're all doing really well. The hot weather was a bit hot for them, but they seem to have survived it quite well. About 24 degrees, so it wasn't that hot really. 26 was the hottest I think we got for a few hours, but it's not that hot compared with most countries. So the cabbages just did pretty much fine with it. The main problem we had though was the wind. We had a really bad storm when we had that cold snap, and we had winds over 50 miles an hour, so that caused a lot of damage. So that's why there's all this extra netting pinned onto the side of the cage. That was just to provide some wind protection, because these cabbages were really getting blown about. And we also got quite a lot of damage elsewhere in the garden. So although it was only about 2 weeks ago, you can see how much the willow has grown, because there's a slight bend in the willow where the storm was, as it got slightly damaged by the wind. So you can see this stem, for example, there's a slight kink in the stem around back here. That's where the growing point was when we had the storm. So you can see in 2 weeks it's probably grown over a foot in height. And this willow is getting close to a meter in height now since it was pruned, so it's growing really fast this year. I have fed this border because we've got loads of raspberries in it, so I'm making sure it's nicely fed so we get a good crop of raspberries. But that seems to have also benefited the willow. It's really growing very nicely. It's also probably benefited from the warm sunny weather this year. It's grown well because it's also had enough water, because it's so close to the vegetable plot that when I water the vegetable plot, this tends to get watered. And also I want to keep the raspberries down, because raspberries really can't withstand hot, dry weather. They're native to Scotland. They like quite cool, damp summers. They grow quite often in woodland areas as well, where it's shaded. So they need to be kept quite damp for a good crop. but they've got loads of flowers this year. Looks like we're going to have a bumper crop. There's lots of bees around at the moment as well, just pollinating them, so I'm expecting to have a really good crop of raspberries. My parents normally do, and as it's such a massive raspberry patch, there's always plenty surplus, so always making things like jams and things like that. At least my mother's making the jams, not me myself. And you can see here we got the other archway, which is growing in nicely as well. But generally I'm very happy with the willow. We did have a slight problem down this end. Something ate off the willow shoots as they were emerging. I'm not sure if it was a bullfinch. The bullfinches are a type of bird around here that eat the buds off young trees. So you can see there's a bit of a gap here. If I pan round, you'll see it more clearly. There's some taller ones here, quite a gap, and then the rest are all quite tall. That's because these were nibbled off by something. So I've just let the lower shoots grow, and it's reshooted since it's got all its original shoots nibbled off, but it's just been really stunted and put back. So these are going to be a lot lower. It'll be interesting to see how much they catch up. The worst ones are over here. They're actually almost getting swamped by the raspberries because they were so much shorter than the rest of them, being eaten off by whatever ate them off. So coming back round to the end here, we've got a few more mature shrubs which are coming on quite nicely. I'm quite surprised at the hydrangea here because it's already got flower buds. And normally hydrangeas in Scotland flower kind of mid to late summer, and the flowers last right through until the frost. So it's quite unusual to see the flower buds forming quite so early. It started forming the flower buds in May, so it'll be interesting to see how it does. It might suffer a bit in this dry weather though. This border doesn't tend to get as much water because it's right on the edge, so we don't want to kind of water the road or the neighbour's house, and it's far enough away from the vegetable plot that I tend to not get a lot of water in this border. So hopefully with the rain we're getting in the next few days, that should help it tide it over. But hydrangeas like a lot of water, so it'll be interesting to see how it does if it does get too dry. And just to the right here is a white rose, which is absolutely covered in flower buds. So I'll hopefully give you an update on this in a couple of weeks. You can see the first white rose there is just starting. A lot of the roses now in the garden are covered in flower buds, just about to start flowering. So that's about the right time for roses to flower here in Scotland, which is kind of mid-June. So give it another week or two, we should have loads of lovely roses, as long as we don't get another storm. Coming along here we've got the Forsythia, which has really grown like crazy. So I gave this a selective pruning the other day because it was starting to swamp over the camellia here, and also the small topiary Lavender we've got there. With Forsythia, I find if you keep trimming it, it doesn't flower very well. So ideally you don't trim it at all, but of course it gets too big, so you do need to prune it. What I do is every year I take off a third of the branches really low down, let new ones grow up, and then they'll flower in 2 years. Forsythia flower on 2 years old growth normally, so they won't flower on last year's growth, they'll flower on the year before. So the way seasons work, it doesn't tend to be 2 years, it tends to be more like 1.5 years, but it's always 2 seasons growth basically. For example, these tall structures grew up last year, didn't have any flowers on this spring, but these will be flowering the next spring. So you don't want to cut them regularly all over, because then you're just going to cut off a lot of the new growth, and that new growth then will flower in 2 years. So in 2 years time you're sacrificing the flowering. So I just selectively harvest 1/3 at a time, and that seems to keep it flowering nicely and stops it from getting too large. Coming down here, we've got the wallflower here that was covered in flowers for most of the spring. It's pretty much finished now. There's a lot of wallflowers in the garden, but they're all spring flowering, so they're all going over. You can see it's got a few flowers left, which is nice to see, and loads of seed pods. So I might let some of these go to seed and self-seed themselves in the garden. They seem to do quite well here with our maritime climate. Wallflowers tend to only live a year or two if they go to seed, but if you keep deadheading them, they'll live for several years. These ones, though, they seem to do so well in our climate that even with going to seed, they seem to survive quite well. So I'll probably just let it go to seed, and then we'll get some more interesting plants as time goes on. And just to the left of that here is this enormous Lovage plant. Lovage is really great for soups. It's got really fragrant foliage, which has really nice flavour for soups. So this will grow absolutely huge. You can see it's already getting close to 2 meters in height, and it's probably going to get to about 3 at the end. And what it's doing now is it's sending up flower stalks. So these will be the flowers. They tend to be yellow. They're not very showy flowers, but they're quite impressive because they're so tall, the plants, especially as this was down at the ground level just a couple of months ago. So, you know, in 2 months it's grown about 2 meters. Huge amount of growth. You can see these big sturdy stems it has. Having to cut a few of the lower leaves off to stop the the cornflowers here being smothered, but you can see those massive stems at the back. They really do grow huge, these plants. So if you do plant a lovage plant in your garden, make sure you give it plenty of space because it will grow into an absolute giant eventually. On the left here we've also got some big buddleias. The buddleia should have been pruned this winter, but I was too late getting around to it, so it's going to get really big this year. I'll need to give that a hard prune later in the season. That normally flowers quite late in the summer, although with this heat wave, who knows, maybe we'll get earlier flowering in the buddleias this year. So next I'd like to show you the eucalyptus here in the middle of the vegetable plot. It has started to put on some new growth, but it really did get damaged by that storm. You can probably see there a lot of the foliage is quite brown. I'll just zoom in a bit. This year it's done better than most, to be honest, because we didn't get the northerly winds during the winter, which is the most damaging winds for this, because you get a lot of the wind damage and salt damage, and it kills off a lot of the foliage. You can see at the top there, the most exposed branches have been damaged, but there's some new growth just starting on them. So I'm expecting it to green up quite nicely. I do find though with this eucalyptus, it's always very late in starting to grow. It always seems to be June until you get any new growth on it. So although most of the trees around here have been putting on new growth for about 2 or 3 weeks now, this one's only just starting. So it's a bit of a late starter, the growth from the eucalyptus, but it grows really fast once it gets going. And so I'm expecting a lot of growth this year. You can see there, new growth just starting on the tips. So this has put on a lot of growth. It's one of the fastest growing trees in the garden, to be honest, even though it does start quite late in the season. This one was planted when my parents first came in to this the house, so this is probably about 6 years old, this plant. You can see it's already a nice small tree. We did remove one of the limbs earlier in the year because we tend to have all the wind from the western side. So all the growth was going on to the east where it was more sheltered, so we've taken out a large limb there which was hanging right over just to keep more of an upright form to the tree. So I'm going to just give you guys a quick update on this side of the garden. This isn't as interesting, it's just between the polytunnel and the wall. We've got the Lavender hedge here, which has really put on a lot of growth. Same with this Sitka spruce. The Sitka spruce, it should be putting on over 1 metre of growth a year. You can see that the sections in between there is how much it grew in previous years, so 1 metre. But we've had a real problem with aphids. There's a particular type of aphid which attacks spruce trees and it causes a huge amount of damage to them. Basically every year all the old leaves, all the old needles fall off the tree. So you can see here there's absolutely no needles. Spruces are evergreens. When these grow new needles, those needles should stay in the tree for probably about 3 or 4 years, maybe up to 10 years sometimes. But at the moment they're only lasting 1 season. So all this growth you can see now is all just from the last few weeks. This was pretty much completely bare just a few weeks ago. It looked really bad, so I'm hoping some beneficial insects will come and eat these aphids, but they just don't seem to, I think because they're so small, the ladybirds and other insects don't seem to eat them. So I'm hoping at some point they're going to sort themselves out and we're not going to have this aphid problem, but otherwise we're going to have some really stunted growth. And to be honest, last year it only grew about 10 centimetres at the top instead of the metre and a bit that it should be growing. So coming along here, got a few plants coming into flower. You've got this Escallonia here, which is looking particularly good this year because often this gets a leaf spot and a lot of the leaves fall off because it doesn't like the damp climate. But this year's been so dry, there's not any real sign of leaf spot. There's a little bit here. You can see this older leaf. You get this kind of these dark spots appearing, and then the whole leaf turns yellow and then falls off. These ones here as well, you can see the disease starting to set in there. But generally it's looking quite good. That'll be absolutely covered in flowers and looking really nice in a few weeks' time. And you can see lots of nice new growth on our Nordman fir here as well. And as an example of me saying how with the spruce trees and fir trees, they should keep their needles for years. So you can see this is this year's growth, last year's needles from 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and if you go down further in the tree, there's probably ones from 5 or 6 years ago. So they should keep their needles for a long time. Coming up here, we've also got a rowan tree in flower. And I'll just take you now to the other rowan tree, which seems to be growing in a very different habit. This one seems to be growing, I think this is probably a variety that was taken from a valley floor or somewhere maybe in Europe where it's warmer. It's growing as a taller tree. The other one, which I'll show you now, is growing as if it's growing on the top of the mountain, because rowans are also known as mountain ash. They grow quite often on top of mountains. So the other variety grows seems to be growing a lot shorter and stouter. Even though it's the same species, there's a lot of variation within the species. So here's the other Rowan tree, and as you can see, it's a lot shorter and stouter. It doesn't put as much vertical growth on, but it puts on a lot of bushy growth. This thing was really congested this year, so I thinned it heavily because it was just too chocked full of branches. The leaves were just getting no light at all. So I thinned it quite heavily. It still managed to flower quite well, so I didn't obviously take too much off. But that's looking quite nice at the moment. Lots of flowers on it. The flowers are just starting to go over with this hot sunshine. You can see they're getting this more of a brown appearance, but they were this nice white appearance when they were fresher. I'll give you a closer look at the broom now. You can see the broom's absolutely covered in flowers. As I said before though, it tends to die after about 5 or 10 years, so it's a short-lived shrub, and that's why there's a lot of these lower stems are looking bare now. We've also got some dying off, like here. I've had to cut off a lot of the branches, so it's slowly dying, and as the time goes by it just keeps losing branches, so eventually this will die off. This is probably going to be one of the last years it's going to look quite so good. I'm going to see if I can bring it back to life. I'm going to feed it a bit, see if that helps. I'm presuming the natural cycle in the wild is because it's a nitrogen fixating plant from the legume family. It can get nitrogen from bacteria that it's in its roots. So I'm wondering if maybe because it's a pioneer species, it grows really fast, fixes lots of nitrogen, then dies off, and then because the soil is enriched with nitrogen, other plants come up and outcompete it. So here it's not getting shaded out, which is normally the way you would get outcompeted. So I'm going to try and feed it lots of high potassium and phosphorus feed, because it's got plenty of nitrogen itself, and with all the flowers it produces every year, it's probably using up a lot of potassium. So I'll give it a high potassium feed, see if that helps it at all. But to be honest, brooms are short-lived. It's probably going to die in a few years anyway. So one of the victims of the storm was actually this larch tree. It fell over to about 45 degrees, facing kind of that way. What I did is I staked it, and it's holding it up for now. So I'll have to keep that staking probably for a year or two. Just show you down here. I staked it, put on a thick rope to hold it upright. I'll probably have to leave that for a year or two until its roots re-establish, and hopefully it'll be firm. It's a real shame because this tree is only about 3 or 4 years old, and it was planted as a tiny seedling, and it's grown probably a meter and a bit every year, so it's really rapid growth. It's getting close to 3 meters now, but the growth's probably going to be put in check this year because of the damage it's had from the wind. It's disturbed the roots. But I'll keep an eye on it. You can also see on the lower branches quite a lot of wind damage. A lot of these needles have gone brown, started to die off. That's just from the wind, so we'll see how it does. Hopefully with some calmer weather it will do a little bit better. Coming around here as well, you can see some of these broken branches from the buddleia here, and the ones hanging down coming off the tree there. That was wind damage as well when we had the storm. But even when we've had this heat wave, to be honest, it's been very gusty winds, about 20 miles an hour. Today's the first day the winds really dropped down, so the wind has been quite problematic this year. It always is in my parents' garden. So hopefully if we can get some more wind breaks, some more trees growing such as this one here, that should solve a lot of the problems with the strong wind, give us a bit of shelter. So I think I'll finish off the garden tour here at my mother's Wildflower Meadow. It's looking like it's going to have loads of flowers this year. Unfortunately, the variety of flowers is going to be a little bit diminished because these daisies seem to have taken over the whole plot. You can see there's just mainly daisies, not much else. We've also got a few other flowers popping up here and there, and we've also got some things like the cow parsley coming up, and there will be some more flowers later on, but at the moment it looks like it's mainly just going to be this daisy coming up. It is quite nice, it's a perennial one. So at the moment it's not in full flower yet, but it's going to be absolutely covered in flowers soon. And you can see, as I said before, there's loads of ladybirds this year. They've been loving the dry weather, so hopefully that's going to deal with most of our aphid problems. Been a particularly good year for ladybirds this year. And we've also got, you can see some nicer, a few wallflowers as well stuck in here coming up. So I'll give you guys an update when this is in full flower, and I'll probably include in that update the plants at the front of the house. I've missed them for now because I didn't want to have this video too long, and these are not quite at their peak. This rose, for example, is going to be flowering soon, and there's quite a few other plants down there that are going to be in full flower soon, but we'll show you quickly the Ceanothus because that's just about to go over and finish flowering. So here's the Ceanothus. As you can see, it's covered in flowers. It would flower even better if we didn't prune it, but then if we didn't prune it, then it would get far too large and it would cover up a lot of the house. So it's doing really well, that Ceanothus, but as I say, I'll give you an update on this front garden later on in another video. I just wanted to show the Ceanothus now because it's probably not going to be in flower when I do the other update for this front section. So that's all for now. Hopefully we'll get some warm weather again soon. It looks like for at least the next week or two it's going to be around 10 degrees maximum or 12 degrees maximum during the day. Quite cold, cool weather, but we really do need the rain. I'll just show you quickly this one patch at the front of the garden, and it's really dried out because it's been so dry. So this patch of the garden has quite poor soil. It's also south-facing, and it never gets the irrigation like the rest of the garden because it's just out of the reach, and it's next to the road, so you don't want to soak anyone walking past. But as you can see, the grass has gone quite brown. The thin soil, the lack of irrigation, it's just dying off. So hopefully we'll get some rain soon, and I'll give you guys an update in a few weeks' time, and hopefully we'll have even more flowers out in the garden by then.